Somewhere deep in the Amazon basin, on a river so wide it looks like a moving sea, a steamboat pushes through the brown water before dawn. The air smells of wet earth and wood smoke. Stacked on the deck, bound in rough cloth and dried into dark bricks, are hundreds of kilograms of raw latex, hauled out of the forest by men who did not choose to be there, loaded by hands that bore no share of the profit, destined for factories and laboratories and naval dockyards on the far side of the world. The steamer's name might be the Liberal, or the Veloz, or the Hamburgo. By the height of the Amazon rubber boom around 1900, vessels like these were the arteries of an entire global industry, threading their way from remote jungle stations down to the export hub of Iquitos, and from there outward toward the Atlantic and the markets beyond. A single raid in 1908 loaded roughly 1,000 arrobas, somewhere close to 15 tons, of rubber onto the gun steamers Liberal and Iquitos in a single operation. Multiply that across dozens of stations, dozens of journeys, and you begin to understand the sheer industrial scale of what was happening in one of the most remote places on Earth. But scale alone does not tell you what it cost. That is the question at the centre of this story, and it is a question that turns out to be surprisingly difficult to answer. Not because the evidence is hidden, but because the forces that benefited from the rubber trade worked hard for a long time to keep the answer from reaching people who might object. What we're going to trace, over the course of this video, is how a sticky white sap that bled from the bark of a tree became one of the most consequential materials in modern history, and how its path from rainforest to global market ran directly through some of the most deliberate and systematic cruelty of the colonial era. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet. The story we are telling follows two things simultaneously: materials and waterways. It begins in the Amazon, where Hevea brasiliensis trees had been tapped by indigenous peoples for generations before European and South American commercial interests arrived and turned a local practice into a continental extraction machine. Between roughly 1870 and 1910, the Amazon rubber boom reshaped the economies of Peru, Colombia and Brazil, produced vast fortunes for a small number of powerful men, and consumed tens of thousands of indigenous lives in the process. Estimates of the death toll from what is now called the Putumayo genocide range from around 32,000 to more than 40,000 people, a figure that carries its own uncertainty, because the people doing the counting often had reasons to count low. One of those powerful men was Julio Cesar Arana, whose Peruvian Amazon company turned the Putumayo River basin into something closer to a slave empire than a business. His enforcers moved by steamer, his rubber moved by steamer, and the terror that made the whole system function was delivered and sustained, station by station, along the same river routes that would eventually carry the evidence of his crimes back to the outside world. That evidence reached people like Roger Casement and Walter Hardenberg, whose testimonies forced a reluctant public to reckon with what the rubber trade actually was. Their story is part of this one. So is the story of Henry Wickham, who in 1876 removed approximately 70,000 Hevea seeds from Brazil, an act that, depending on whom you ask, was either audacious scientific enterprise or outright smuggling, and delivered them to Kew Gardens, where around 2,400 germinated and eventually gave rise to plantation agriculture across British-controlled Southeast Asia. Those plantations would, within a generation, eclipse the Amazon entirely and redirect the global shipping routes for natural rubber in ways that are still felt today. And then there is Gutta-percha, a different material, from a different tree, harvested through its own pattern of ecological destruction in Southeast Asia. Gutta-percha made the first undersea telegraph cables possible. It made the modern world's nervous system possible, and its story is tangled up with naval engineering, with empire and with the same logic of extraction that made the Amazon boom so violent. We will also pass through Henry Ford's strange dream of an American city in the Amazon jungle, a place called Fordlandia, where the myth of a pure and controllable rubber source crashed against the reality of leaf blight and labour revolt, and we will arrive eventually in the present, where more than half of the world's natural rubber still comes from Southeast Asia, and where questions about deforestation and supply chain accountability echo, with uncomfortable precision, the questions that investigators were asking more than a century ago. The rivers carried all of it: the rubber, the steamers, the violence, and eventually the truth. Follow the water, and the history reveals itself. Long before the steamboats and the slave raids, before the fortified stations and the enforcers with their rifles, there was simply a tree and a wound. The Hevea brasiliensis grows throughout the Amazon basin, tall and straight-trunked, its canopy reaching toward the forest ceiling like everything else competing for light. When a tapir draws a blade across its bark in a shallow diagonal groove, not deep enough to damage the living tissue beneath, just enough to breach the outer layer, the tree responds the way a living thing does when it's cut. It bleeds. The fluid that rises and runs is a milky white latex, faintly sweet-smelling, warm from the forest heat. Tapirs have learned to cut in the early morning hours, when the internal pressure is highest and the latex flows most freely, collecting it in small cups or bowls fixed to the trunk below the wound. A single tree, tended carefully and allowed to recover between cuttings, can produce for decades. Indigenous peoples of the Amazon had known this for generations. They used the latex to waterproof baskets and cloth, to make balls for games, to coat their feet against the wet ground. When Portuguese and Spanish travellers first encountered it in the 16th and 17th centuries, they were fascinated but uncertain what to do with a substance that hardened strangely in the cold and softened to uselessness in the heat. That uncertainty lasted for 2 centuries. Then, in 1839, a Connecticut inventor named Charles Goodyear accidentally dropped a mixture of rubber and sulphur onto a hot stove. What he pulled away was something new, a rubber that held its shape across a range of temperatures, that stretched and snapped back, that resisted abrasion and water with equal stubbornness. Vulcanization, as the process came to be called, transformed a curiosity into an industrial necessity almost overnight. The 19th century was hungry for exactly what rubber could now offer. Steam-driven machinery needed flexible belts to transfer power between moving parts, tight hoses to carry pressurized fluids, gaskets and seals to keep engines from leaking themselves into ruin. Factories needed waterproof flooring, surgeons needed waterproof gloves, sailors needed waterproof coats. As railways expanded across continents and roads began carrying wheeled vehicles faster than horses had ever pulled them, the demand for solid and eventually pneumatic rubber tyres grew from a novelty into an industrial imperative. By the close of the century, the bicycle boom alone was absorbing rubber faster than existing sources could comfortably supply. And then there were the wires. The telegraph was remaking global communication in the 1840s and 1850s, linking cities by land with copper cables that hummed with electrical signals. But copper needed insulation, a sheath that could carry it through wet ground, through rivers, and eventually beneath the ocean itself. Natural rubber, properly processed, could do this on land. For undersea work, engineers turned to a related material called Gutta-percha, drawn from the plaquium trees of Southeast Asia, which remained stable and pliable in cold seawater in ways that ordinary rubber did not. When the first transatlantic telegraph cable was laid in the late 1850s, it was gutta-percha that wrapped the copper core, sealing it against the deep ocean. Imports of the material into Britain reached enormous volumes in the early 1850s as cable-laying projects multiplied. A world that wanted to whisper secrets across oceans was built, in no small part from the sap of trees. All of this industrial hunger pointed back toward one place, the Amazon basin. Before Asian plantations existed, the Amazon was the world's only substantial commercial source of wild Hevea latex. Brazil's rubber exports grew at a pace that would seem almost impossible if the historical records did not confirm it, roughly 60-fold between 1827 and 1848 alone. The trees were already there, already tapped in some areas, already understood. What changed was the scale of demand pressing against the forest from the outside. The port cities that handled this trade were transformed in the process. Belém, near the mouth of the Amazon. Manaus, 1,000 miles upriver, where a famous opera house would eventually rise as a monument to the fortunes being made. Iquitos, further still, pressed against the edge of what was navigable for ocean-going vessels but thrumming with the commerce of the boom. These places were nodes in a supply chain that stretched, unbroken, from the forest tappers all the way to the rubber workshops of Birmingham and Boston, to the cable-laying ships anchored in the mid-Atlantic, to the naval dockyards where engineers fitted new machinery with flexible joints and waterproof seals. Rubber connected the deep interior of South America to the industrial world as surely as any road or railway. It flowed out of the trees, down the rivers, through the export houses, onto the steamships, and across the ocean. It was not yet clear, to the investors and factory owners on the receiving end, what the full cost of that connection was. That knowledge was building slowly in the forests and along the rivers, and it would take years and considerable courage to carry it in the other direction. To understand how rubber moved from the forest to the factory floor, you have to understand the rivers. The Amazon is not one river in the way that most rivers are one river. It is a system, a branching, flooding, seasonally shifting web of waterways that penetrates the South American interior the way veins penetrate living tissue. The main channel runs for more than 4,000 miles from its Andean headwaters to the Atlantic, and it is wide enough in places that a sailor standing on the deck of a midstream vessel cannot see either bank. But what made the Amazon commercially revolutionary was not just its size, it was its depth. Ocean-going steamers could push upriver as far as Manaus, roughly 1,000 miles inland, riding water deep enough to accommodate vessels built for open seas. Smaller steamboats could go further still, pressing up the tributaries into zones that would have been unreachable by any other means, zones where the forest closed overhead and the air was thick with humidity and the sound of insects, and where, tapped by hands that had been doing so for generations, the hevea trees still bled their white latex into the morning light. Iquitos sits approximately 2,200 miles from the Atlantic coast by the river's winding measure. On a map it looks like an impossibility, a city stranded deep in the Peruvian Amazon, landlocked by every metric except the one that mattered, the river reaching it like a long arm extended from the ocean. In 1851, Iquitos was barely a settlement, a Catholic mission outpost with perhaps 200 residents. By 1900, estimates place its population at around 20,000, though some accounts suggest the number climbed still higher in the years that followed. A city had materialized in the jungle, and what had summoned it was rubber. The transformation followed the logic of extraction frontiers everywhere, but accelerated by the particular geography of the river. Merchant houses established themselves in Iquitos, then in Manaus, then in Belém near the river's mouth, forming a chain of commercial nodes through which latex moved in one direction, and capital, goods, and credit moved in the other. Foreign investment arrived quickly. British houses, Brazilian trading firms, and eventually corporate entities with shareholders in London and New York recognized that the Amazon was not simply producing a commodity. It was producing the commodity that industrial civilization had decided it could not do without. The Peruvian Amazon Company, formalized in 1907 from the family firm of a trader named Julio César Arana, would eventually secure British registration and outside financing, binding the deep forest to the financial mechanisms of a world thousands of miles away. The vessel that made this possible was the steamship, and it is worth pausing on this, because the story of the rubber boom is inseparable from the story of riverine steam navigation. Before the steamboat, the Amazon's upper tributaries were effectively isolated. Dugout canoes and wooden rivercraft moved slowly against the current, at the mercy of floods and seasonal channels that shifted year by year. Steam changed the terms entirely. A riverboat running on wood fuel cut from the forest banks could move upstream against the current, with a regularity and predictability that transformed commercial calculation. Schedules became possible. Cargo manifests became reliable. The interior was, for the first time, legible to the outside world in the language of commerce. Specific vessels acquired specific reputations. The Liberal, built in 1904 for J.C. Arana y Hermanos, the trading house that would become the Peruvian Amazon Company, was one of the most important ships on the Putumayo River corridor. In 1907 alone, the Liberal carried loads of raw latex exceeding 93,000 kilograms downriver toward Iquitos. By 1910 it was still running, moving 60 tons of rubber in a single reported period, along with the merchants, soldiers and enforcers who travelled the same route. The Cosmopolita ran the same waters. Other vessels, whose names appear and disappear from period reports, worked the Ucayali and the Marañón, pressing into tributaries the larger boats could not reach, and ferrying their cargo to the collection points where the bigger steamers waited. What the steamships carried was not only rubber, they carried the entire social world of the boom. There were the station bosses, the men who operated the rubber extraction points deep in the forest, answerable to the merchant houses and in turn exercising near absolute authority over the people beneath them. There were the agents of those merchant houses, men who moved between stations and cities carrying credit, supplies, and instructions. There were the river crews who knew the channels and the currents, who could navigate by feel through the flooded forest in the wet season when the water rose to cover the routes and the usual landmarks disappeared. There were merchants of various nationalities, Peruvian, Brazilian, Colombian, British, whose interests converged in Iquitos at the warehouses and trading floors where rubber was weighed, graded, and prepared for export. And then there were the indigenous communities into whose territory all of this had moved. The Huitoto, the Bora, the Andoke, and other peoples of the upper Amazon and its tributaries had been navigating these rivers and forests long before the first steamboat arrived. They understood the trees, the seasonality of the latex flows, the geography of the waterways. In the early years of the boom, some communities participated in the rubber trade on terms that were at least nominally voluntary, exchanging rubber for trade goods, operating within a patron-client system that, while unequal and often coercive in practice, had some recognizable structure. But as the boom intensified and the demand from distant markets grew more insistent, the character of that relationship changed. The merchant houses needed more rubber, faster, with less friction, and at lower cost. The distance between the forest stations and any legal authority was measured in weeks of river travel. In that distance, the conditions under which rubber was collected began to shift towards something darker. The financial architecture that supported all of this was genuinely impressive in its reach. The Peruvian Amazon Company's vessels reportedly operated under arrangements with the Peruvian government that effectively gave the company's ships quasi-official status on the river. British and American consuls later noted that the company's steamers functioned without charge for state purposes, a detail that reveals how thoroughly private extraction and state interest had become entangled. Credit flowed from European banking houses to Iquitos merchant firms, from those firms to regional bosses, from the bosses to the station operators. At each step the debt deepened, and at each step the pressure to extract more rubber, faster at whatever cost, intensified. By the close of the 19th century and into the first decade of the 20th, Iquitos had become a city of strange contrasts. Iron-fronted buildings imported from Portugal lined its central streets. Tiled facades gave the downtown a faintly European character that seemed almost hallucinatory, surrounded by jungle. The Opera House at Manaus, far downriver, stands as the most famous emblem of boom-era excess. But Iquitos had its own version of this dissonance, a frontier city that had built itself on the proceeds of an extraction economy and decorated itself with the trappings of civilization. In 1911, the city shipped 44,000 tons of rubber, representing roughly 9% of Peru's total export value at the time, though figures from the period vary and should be understood as approximations rather than precise measures. The steamers moved through all of it, upriver loaded with goods, enforcers and expectations, downriver laden with rubber bales, carrying the weight of what the forest had been made to yield. They were the arteries of the system, the mechanism that transformed a scattered network of forest stations into something that could claim, on paper, to be a modern commercial enterprise. What was happening in those forest stations, far from the iron-fronted buildings and the import houses, was another matter entirely, and the rivers that carried the rubber outward were, eventually, the same rivers that would carry the first accounts of what the boom had cost. Julio César Arana was not a man who arrived in the Amazon by accident. He came with purpose, with patience, and with an instinct for leverage that would have served him well in any commercial century. Born in 1864 in Rioja, a small Peruvian town on the eastern slope of the Andes, he began his working life as a hat seller, travelling through jungle towns trading with rubber tappers, learning the rhythms of the extraction economy from its outer edges. By the 1890s, he had moved from selling hats to extending credit, and from credit to controlling debt. By the turn of the century, he was operating a trading house, J.C., Arana Hermanos, that dominated commerce along the Putumayo River, one of the Amazon's northern tributaries, where it traced the contested border between Peru and Colombia. The trading house became a corporation in 1907, registered not in Lima but in London, with capital of £1 million sterling and shareholders who understood very little about the river except that it was producing returns. The Peruvian Amazon Company, as it was formerly known, was the institutional face of something that had been operating in practice for years before it acquired a name on a London stock registry. What Arana had built in the Putumayo was not simply a commercial operation. It was a system, interlocking, self-reinforcing, and almost entirely closed from outside scrutiny. The geography helped. The Putumayo Basin in this period was as remote as anywhere on Earth that humans regularly inhabited. The nearest Peruvian administrative centre was Iquitos, weeks of river travel downstream. The Colombian and British consular authorities were further still. There were no roads, there were no telegraph lines into the forest. What existed were the rivers, and upon the rivers Arana's boats, and those boats ran on his schedule, carried his cargo, and answered to his captains. A man who controlled the only practical means of travel and communication into a region controlled the region. The architecture of that control was built on a foundation of debt and quota. Indigenous workers, primarily from the Huitoto and Bora peoples, though the system eventually drew in the Resigaro, the Andoke, the Okaina, the Munain, and others whose communities occupied the forests and river margins of the upper Putumayo, were bound into the company's labour system through a mechanism that replicated in cruder and more violent form arrangements that existed across the Amazon extraction economy. They were given trade goods, cloth, tools, salt, metal implements. These goods were recorded as debts. The debts had to be repaid in rubber. The accounting was kept by station managers, in ledgers that the workers could not read and had no means of challenging. The debts, almost by design, could never be fully cleared. Each rubber collection cycle, known as a fabrico, had a quota attached to it. The standard figure, as recorded in period accounts, was 5 arrobas, roughly 75 kilograms of raw latex per worker per cycle. This was not a suggestion, it was a requirement, enforced by men who had both the authority and the weapons to make it stick. Workers who failed to meet their quota faced punishments that escalated in systematic fashion. First the whip, administered in front of assembled workers and family members, then the sipo, a heavy stock that locked a person's neck, wrists or ankles in place for days at a time, then starvation, isolation, or in cases that investigators would later document in careful, damning detail, execution. The men who administered this system on the ground were the station managers and their enforcers, and it is here that the mechanics of Arana's frontier become particularly precise. In 1904 and 1905, the company recruited approximately 30 men from Barbados, then a British colony, to serve as armed overseers. These Barbadian enforcers occupied a middle rank in the company's hierarchy, above the indigenous workers who collected the rubber, below the station managers who ran the collection points, and answerable ultimately to the company's regional directors, who answered in turn to Arana. They were the company's physical presence at the point where the system met the forest, and their presence gave the operation a veneer of international labour recruitment that would later complicate Britain's diplomatic response, since the Barbadians were British subjects. The stations themselves, La Carrera, Santa Catalina, La Sabana, El Encanto and others scattered through the forest along the Putumayo and its smaller tributaries, were not simply trading posts. They were fortified. Some were equipped with cannon. All were guarded. They served simultaneously as collection hubs where rubber was weighed and recorded, as supply depots from which goods were distributed and debts accumulated, and as places of detention and punishment where the enforcement of the quota system was most visible and most brutal. Around each station, extending into the forest for a radius of many miles, were the communities of workers whose labour fed it. The raids known as correrias, violent incursions into communities that had resisted the system or failed their quotas, were conducted by armed company men and by a class of indigenous intermediaries the company called muchachos de confianza, or trusted boys. Men drawn from local communities who, through a combination of coercion, reward, and long exposure to the system's logic, had become instruments of its enforcement against their own neighbours. The correrias were not random violence, they were operational. They served to bring new communities into the debt system, to punish collective failure to meet quotas, and to demonstrate across the forest what resistance cost. By 1906, this system was extracting roughly £1.4 million, approximately 640 tonnes, of rubber annually from the Putumayo basin. The latex was baled at the fortified stations, loaded onto the company's river steamers, and carried downstream to Iquitos, where it entered the export market as a commodity indistinguishable on a trading floor from rubber produced anywhere else in the Amazon. It moved from Iquitos to the Atlantic ports, from the ports to European and North American factories, and from the factories into the tyres, hoses, gaskets, and industrial components of a civilization that had made itself dependent on this particular material. The distance between the forest station and the factory floor was enormous in every sense, and that distance was the system's protection. What it meant for the Huitoto and the Bora, for the specific communities whose lives were organised around the company's schedules and quotas, was a transformation of daily existence so thoroughgoing that it reshaped the social fabric of the forest. Men were absent for extended periods, moving through the forest, tapping trees and carrying loads of coagulated latex. Women and children remained near the stations, which functioned as a form of hostage holding. As long as families were within reach, workers were less likely to flee. The forest, which had sustained these communities across generations through farming, hunting and fishing, became increasingly secondary to the imperatives of rubber production. Community ceremonies, seasonal practices, and the ordinary patterns of reciprocal life were disrupted or suspended. What replaced them was a regime of supervised labour and enforced debt that penetrated into structures no external authority had previously reached. The death toll that resulted from this system, through violence, starvation, disease, displacement, and the destruction of the social bonds that had sustained communities before the boom, is estimated by most scholars at somewhere between 30 and 40,000 lives, though the figures vary among sources and the true count may never be fully known. What is certain is that the Putumayo genocide, as it would eventually be named and recognised, was not incidental to the rubber trade. It was the rubber trade, conducted at the scale and with the methods that the distance, the debt and the demands of the global market had made possible. Arana managed all of this from Iquitos and then increasingly from London, where the company's financial affairs required his presence. He was a man of apparent respectability, well-dressed, fluent in the language of commerce, capable of presenting his enterprise in terms that satisfied investors and for a time regulators. The forest was far away, the ledgers showed profit, and the steamers on the Putumayo continued to run, carrying latex downstream and carrying, though no one yet knew how far it would travel, the evidence of what the boom had cost. The distance that protected Arana's system also preserved it from scrutiny, but within the Putumayo basin itself there was nothing abstract about what the rubber regime required. It had a texture, a daily rhythm, and a set of instruments that anyone living inside it understood with complete clarity. The quota was the architecture of everything. At most stations along the Putumayo and its tributaries, the standard was set at 5 arrobas, roughly 75 kilograms of raw latex, per worker, per collection cycle. Each cycle ran approximately 3 months, long enough for a man to move through the forest tapping trees, coagulating the sap over smoke, and carrying the resulting bales back to the station. 75 kilograms sounds, on paper, like a manageable figure. In practice, producing that volume meant working across vast stretches of forest, often with inadequate tools, with no reliable source of food except what could be found or carried, and under conditions of surveillance that left almost no room for rest. The trees themselves were not infinitely productive. As the more accessible stands were bled dry, workers were pushed further into the forest, covering greater distances for diminishing returns. The quota, meanwhile, did not adjust to reflect the declining productivity of the trees. It was a fixed demand in a system of diminishing supply, and the workers were the ones required to resolve that contradiction with their bodies. When a worker failed to meet his quota, whether through illness, through the exhaustion of nearby trees, through misfortune, or through the mathematics of a system designed to ensure that complete success was perpetually just out of reach, the enforcement machinery of the station moved into motion. The progression was, in its way, systematic. A first failure might bring flogging, administered publicly, in front of assembled workers and their families. The public nature of the punishment was not incidental. It was the point. The station manager's authority rested on his ability to make the consequences of failure visible to everyone who might ever consider falling short. Beyond the whip was the sipo, a heavy wooden stock that locked the neck, wrists or ankles of a prisoner into fixed position, sometimes for days at a time. Men left in the sipo under the equatorial sun without food or water sometimes died there. Sometimes that was the intention. More severe failures, persistent resistance, attempted flight, organizing other workers, could result in starvation, prolonged detention, or execution. These outcomes were not rare aberrations in an otherwise functional labor system. They were the system. The commission structures that the company imposed on its station managers, men who received bonuses based on the tonnage of rubber their stations delivered, meant that the incentive to push production higher ran directly parallel to the incentive to push punishment harder. Violence was not a byproduct of the commercial logic. It was built into the accounting. The correrias, the slave raids, were the mechanism by which the system expanded and replenished itself. When communities resisted incorporation into the debt quota regime, or when populations within the system had been so depleted by death and flight that labour shortages threatened production, armed parties moved out from the stations into the surrounding forest. These were organised operations. They had leaders, weapons and objectives. A correria might sweep through a village without warning, taking men, women and children as captives, driving them through the forest on forced marches that could cover 100 kilometres or more without adequate food or rest. The pace was set by the armed party, not by the capacity of the captives to survive it. Deaths on these marches, from exhaustion, starvation and exposure, were treated as an acceptable cost. The loss absorbed into the arithmetic of a system that measured success in rubber tonnage rather than in lives. The captives who survived the march arrived at a station already weakened, disoriented, and severed from the communities and kinship networks that might have offered them some form of protection or solidarity. They were inducted into the debt system immediately, given goods they had not asked for, assigned debts they had not incurred, and set to work against quotas they had had no part in establishing. Hostage holding, retaining women and children at or near the station while men worked the forest, was standard practice, a mechanism that made flight not merely dangerous but unthinkable for anyone with family still within the company's reach. The people who administered the system at its most immediate level were a layered hierarchy. At the top of the forest structure sat the station managers, men like Armando Normand and Abelardo Aguero, whose names would later appear in investigation documents alongside accounts of extraordinary cruelty. Below them, and essential to the system's daily operation, were two groups that gave it both reach and deniability. The Barbadian enforcers, approximately 200 men recruited from Britain's Caribbean colony between 1904 and 1905, served as armed overseers, carrying out punishments, guarding prisoners, and maintaining the physical coercion that kept the labour system functioning. Their presence was, among other things, a legal complication. As subjects of the British Crown, their testimony was something that consular officials could be compelled to collect, and would eventually be what gave investigators a credible path into documenting what the company preferred to keep invisible. The muchacho de confianza occupied a different and in some ways more troubling position. These were indigenous men, drawn from the same communities as the workers themselves, who had been absorbed into the company's enforcement apparatus over time, through combinations of coercion, selective reward, and the relentless pressure of a system that offered very few other options for survival. They served as guides, translators, executioners, and hunters of those who fled. They knew the forest intimately. They knew the languages of the surrounding communities. They were, by the time Arana's system reached its full extension, among the most effective instruments of its violence, and their involvement ensured that the company's reach extended into social spaces that no outsider could easily penetrate. What this machinery produced across the years of its operation was a death toll that remains difficult to state with precision and impossible to state without acknowledgement of what the uncertainty itself represents. Barbadian witness John Brown, whose testimony would later form part of the core documentation of the atrocity, estimated that approximately 40,000 people died over the course of 10 years. Demographic studies conducted in the years following the rubber boom reached figures that tell a different kind of story. A Witoto population recorded at roughly 50,000 in 1906 and at somewhere near 8,000 by 1911. Whether the deaths are counted at the lower end of serious scholarly estimates, around 32,000, or at the higher figures suggested by eyewitness testimony and demographic collapse, the range is a range of catastrophe. Sources differ, methodologies differ, and the chaos and deliberate concealment that characterized the regime mean that full accounting was never possible, even for those who tried to make it. What the figures share, across their variation, is a scale that places the putumayo among the documented atrocities of the colonial extraction era. And yet for years, the system remained largely unknown beyond the forest. The rubber moved downstream. The ledgers showed profit. The distance between the Putumayo stations and the London boardroom where the Peruvian Amazon Company conducted its financial business was not merely geographic, it was epistemic. Investors asked about tonnage and dividends, not about the cipo or the correria. The question of how the rubber was actually produced and at whose cost required someone willing to travel into the forest and ask different questions. Those witnesses were coming. Some of them were already on the river. The witnesses were coming, but they would arrive by the same vessels that carried the rubber out. That is the particular irony of the Putumayo's river system. The boats that made the atrocity possible also, eventually, made its documentation possible. The steamers moved in both directions, carrying the weight of extraction one way, and, in time, the weight of testimony the other. But before the testimony came, the commerce, and the commerce moved on water. The Putumayo Basin offered no roads, no railways, and no overland route by which a ton of raw latex could be carried to market in anything resembling an economic time frame. What it offered was a network of rivers, the Putumayo itself, the Igara-Paraná, the Cara-Paraná, threading through hundreds of kilometers of dense forest, connecting the interior stations to the town of Iquitos, and from Iquitos to the wider Amazon, and from the Amazon to the Atlantic and the markets beyond. Without river transport, the rubber stayed in the forest. With it, the forest could be emptied, and the proceeds converted into sterling on a London exchange. The rivers were not passive geography. They were infrastructure, and the steamers that moved along them were the machines that turned a system of extreme violence into a commercially viable enterprise. The most important of those machines was a screw steamer built in Glasgow and commissioned by J.C. Arana Hermanos, the company that would later reorganize itself under British registration as the Peruvian Amazon Company. She was called the Liberal, and she entered the Putumayo trade around 1904. At 148 gross registered tons, she was not a large vessel by the standards of her era, but she was perfectly suited to the specific geography of her work. The upper tributaries of the Amazon system were shallow in the dry season, narrow in places, and far enough from open ocean that a larger, deeper drafted ship could never have operated on them. The Liberal could. She worked the rivers the way the rubber stations worked the forest, pressing into spaces that seemed to resist access, finding passage where passage appeared impossible. Her route ran between Iquitos and the principal Putumayo collection stations, particularly La Chorrera and El Encanto, two names that would later become synonymous with some of the worst documented violence of the genocide. The Liberal was the connection between those stations and the wider world. She brought in provisions, personnel, and weapons on her upstream voyages, She brought out rubber on her downstream ones, and the quantity she carried documented, almost inadvertently, the scale of what the system was producing. In September of 1907, the Liberal was reported to have brought 93,000 kilograms of elastic rubber into Iquitos on a single voyage. Later assessments during Roger Casement's 1910 inspection recorded approximately 60 tons aboard the steamer, a cargo then valued at around £45,000 sterling. In a single hull, in a single river passage, there was enough rubber to supply European factories for months, enough to make investors comfortable, enough to obscure, in the clarity of commercial arithmetic, the human arithmetic that had produced it. The Liberal made approximately 3 voyages a year during the peak years of extraction. Combined with sister vessels, as the Cosmopolita, the Velos and others, the Peruvian Amazon Company was moving roughly 200 tons of rubber annually through its river network. Each ton of that rubber had a quota behind it, and behind the quota was everything the previous section of this story has described. The Velos occupied a different role in the network. Faster and lighter than the Liberal, she served as the swift connection between stations, carrying personnel between posts, ferrying company agents and Barbadian enforcers along the river corridor, as the logic of the season demanded. Where the Liberal was the heavy hauler, the freighter of the operation, the Velos was its responsive instrument, able to move people and small consignments quickly when the system required it. Casement's consular reports mention the Velos in the context of keeping the extraction network responsive to market conditions, a phrase that, in context, means keeping the Terror calibrated to the price of rubber in London. Her exact specifications are not preserved in major ship registries, most of what we know of her coming from Casement's notes and from Walter Hardenberg's first-hand account, but her function in the system is clear enough. She was the speed of the operation, as the Liberal was its volume. Neither vessel sailed entirely alone. The gunboat Iquitos accompanied them on the more dangerous stretches of the river network, particularly when the company's territorial claims were contested by Colombian outposts or by communities that had not yet been incorporated into the labour system. The Iquitos carried cannons, machine guns and Peruvian troops, and her presence transformed the steamers from commercial vessels into something more like a naval expedition. In January of 1908, operations involving the Iquitos and associated steamers were directed against Colombian outposts at La Union and La Reserva, extending the company's frontier through armed force. The line between commercial navigation and military occupation was, on the Putumayo, essentially non-existent. The boats enforced the boundary between Arana's territory and everything outside it, and the boundary was maintained by firepower. What the Liberal and the Velos accomplished, and what their gunboat escort ensured, was the conversion of geographic isolation from a limitation into a tool. The same remoteness that kept the interior stations beyond the reach of oversight made the rubber, once collected and loaded aboard a steamer, remarkably secure in transit. There was no port authority to inspect cargo manifests against labour records. There was no customs official in Iquitos asking how the rubber had been harvested. The steamer arrived from the interior, her hold full, and what happened upriver stayed upriver. The Liberal moved through the river system like a seal on a transaction. Her arrival in Iquitos validated the commerce, converted the forest output into tradable commodity, and closed the circuit between frontier violence and global capital. This is the aspect of the steamers that goes beyond their function as transport vessels. They were the mechanism by which the rubber trade's particular brutality became invisible to those who benefited from it. Investors in the Peruvian Amazon Company held shares in a registered British firm that operated river steamers in South America. The steamers returned with rubber. The rubber was sold. Dividends were paid. The violence that produced the rubber, the quota, the SIPO, the Correria, the 40,000 dead, existed only on the far side of the Liberals' last upstream passage, in a world that the ledgers did not describe and that the shareholders did not, for the most part, ask to visit. What those steamers were, in the end, was a translation device. They took something produced by one logic, the logic of terror, of coercion, of debt bondage enforced at gunpoint in a forest that the world could not easily see, and delivered it into another logic entirely, the logic of commodity markets, quarterly returns, and the clean language of trade. The Liberal did not carry the putumayo's violence in her hold alongside the rubber. She left it behind, upriver, inaccessible, belonging to a different world. That was her most important function, not the tonnage, not the speed, the translation. But the rivers ran in both directions, and some things travelled upstream that the company had not planned for. The same vessels that made the system scalable made it, in time, penetrable. Roger Casement boarded a steamer at Iquitos in 1910, travelling toward La Chorrera with his notebooks and his questions, riding the same current that had carried the rubber out. The Liberal and her sisters had built a road into the Putumayo. They had not considered, when they built it, who else might use it. It began, as many great reckonings do, not with a diplomat or an investigator, but with an accident. Walter Hardenberg was an American engineer, 23 years old, travelling through the Putumayo Basin in late 1907 with a companion, looking for work on construction projects near the Colombian border. He was not a journalist. He was not a reformer. He had no particular reason to be in that part of the forest at all, and no particular ambition to document what he found there. But ambition, in his case, was not required. What he found him. Near the Caraparaná River, Hardenberg and his companion were seized by armed men working for a local rubber agent, men in the employ of the same network of stations that Arana's company controlled. They were taken to the Encanto station, El Encanto, one of the most feared posts in the entire Putumayo system, and there, in the weeks that followed, Hardenberg saw what the Liberal had been carrying out for years. He saw indigenous workers in conditions of starvation. He saw bodies that had been worked until they stopped and were then disposed of in the Caraparaná, the river receiving them the way it received everything else the stations produced. He was, in the most literal sense, a captive witness. He could not look away, and he could not leave. The system had built its walls carefully, and for a time those walls held him too. Eventually released, Hardenberg left the Putumayo carrying something that no steamer manifest would record: memory. Over the following years, he organised what he had witnessed into testimony, gathered accounts from others who had survived the stations, and in 1912 published a book in London under the title The Putumayo, The Devil's Paradise. His language was not diplomatic. He described the Peruvian Amazon Company as a gang of human beasts operating beneath the cover of English registration, converting British corporate respectability into a shield behind which organised murder proceeded without interruption. The book moved through London's reading public with the particular velocity of something that confirms a horror people have half suspected, but never quite believed. Hardenberg's account was the first crack in the wall. But cracks are not demolitions. The company had a response ready, and it was delivered in the smooth register of corporate denial. The Peruvian Amazon Company, its directors insisted, bore no responsibility for conditions in the Putumayo. It was, in any case, a company Peruvian in its operations even if English in its name, and questions of labour practices in the Peruvian interior were matters for Peruvian authorities. The deflection was practised and precise. It worked for a while on certain audiences. What it could not survive was the arrival of Roger Casement. Casement came to the Putumayo with credentials that made him impossible to dismiss. He was a British consul, a man whose prior investigations into the atrocities of the Belgian Congo rubber regime had already made him, by 1910, one of the most experienced witnesses to colonial brutality in the world. He understood the grammar of extraction, knew what quota systems produced, knew how corporate structures were arranged to insulate shareholders from accountability, knew the particular architecture of violence that grows when distance and profit combine. When the Foreign Office authorised his inquiry into the Peruvian Amazon Company, it was not sending a naive inspector into unfamiliar terrain. It was sending someone who had already seen this exact thing in different forests, speaking different languages, under a different flag. Casement travelled upriver on the same vessels that had carried the rubber out. He reached La Carrera, reached El Encanto, moved through the station network with his notebooks and his questions, and what he assembled, piece by piece, was a portrait of organised terror so detailed and so documented that it could not be waved away with the language of corporate distance. The rubber stations were fortified posts. The quota system was enforced by flogging, by starvation, by the cepo, and by execution. These were not the excesses of individual agents acting beyond their authority. They were the system. The architecture of the violence was administrative, rational in its own terms, and traceable directly back to the company's operational structure. His most powerful instruments were not his own observations. They were people, the Barbadian workers employed by the company as enforcers and overseers, British subjects whose testimony the Foreign Office could not easily set aside. Around 30 sworn depositions were collected from these men in 1910. They had participated in the system. Some of them had administered it. And now, faced with a British consul whose questions carried the weight of official inquiry, they described what they had done and what they had seen with a specificity that no corporate denial could dissolve. The depositions detailed floggings counted in hundreds of lashes. They described killings treated as routine. They named agents, named stations, named the precise mechanics of a regime of terror that had been operating year after year just beyond the reach of any oversight willing to look directly at it. Casement's confidential report to the Foreign Office in 1911 laid the full picture out. The rubber stations were not commercial outposts that had been poorly managed. They were something closer to fortified prisons, and the surrounding forest was the labour pool from which the population was drawn by force and kept in line by the credible threat of death. The report prompted the Peruvian authorities to issue 215 arrest warrants against company agents in June of that year. The number was remarkable. So perhaps was what happened next. Almost none of those warrants were executed. The company moved quickly. Payments were made. The prefect Zapata received what sources describe as somewhere between £5,000 and £8,000, and the arrested agents began to find their way back to freedom. The machinery of justice had been engaged. The machinery of money moved faster, and yet something had already shifted that money could not entirely reverse. The evidence was no longer contained within the forest, it had travelled. This is the particular irony that the previous section of this story approached from one direction and that now becomes fully visible. The imperial networks that made the rubber trade possible, the steamers, the telegraph cables, the shipping lanes, were the same networks that carried the exposure. Casement travelled upriver on vessels the company had commissioned. His reports were transmitted through British consular cables. Hardenberg's testimony reached London via the transatlantic routes that also carried rubber orders and commodity prices. The anti-slavery reporter published accounts of the Putumayo atrocities. The Times picked them up. Parliamentary debates followed, questions addressed to ministers who now had, on record, the sworn testimony of British subjects describing what the company was doing in the Peruvian interior. The scandal moved through the imperial information system with the efficiency of any other high-value cargo. Diplomatic pressure arrived from the British consulate. The company's shares, once comfortable instruments of return for investors who preferred not to ask questions, became associated publicly with the specific horrors that Hardenberg had named and Casement had documented. The language of corporate denial, the insistence that the company was only English in name, that Peruvian conditions were beyond its authority, grew thinner with each successive publication of testimony, each parliamentary question, each newspaper account of the Barbadian depositions. What Hardenberg and Casement had done, between them, was use the Empire's own infrastructure against one of its embedded interests. The cables and steamers and newspapers that kept the rubber flowing also kept information flowing, and information, once released into that network, moved with its own momentum. The wall the company had built around the Putumayo was made of distance, not stone. When the distance collapsed, when testimony boarded the same vessels that had carried rubber out, the wall came with it. The full weight of justice was another matter. Arana himself would never be convicted. The warrants dissolved in the heat of bribery and jurisdictional ambiguity, and the death toll, estimates ranging from 32,000 to more than 40,000 indigenous lives, would never be formally reckoned with in a courtroom. But the exposure had done something that could not be undone. It had named what had been nameless, it had described what had been invisible, and it had demonstrated with uncomfortable clarity that the same global systems that moved rubber from forest to factory were also capable of moving conscience from witness to world, if someone was willing to make the journey. The seeds of the Amazon's rubber empire had already travelled far beyond the forest by then, carried in a different kind of container toward a different kind of ending. The seeds the previous section gestured toward had, in fact, already left Brazil by the time Casement was taking his notes on the Putumayo. They had left quietly, in the hold of a single vessel, carried by a single man whose motives were neither purely heroic nor entirely dishonest, a man who existed somewhere in the ambiguous territory between adventurer and agent, between collector and thief, depending on whose history you are reading. His name was Henry Wickham, and in 1876 he loaded approximately 70,000 Hevea brasiliensis seeds onto a ship and removed them from the Amazon basin without, as Brazil has argued ever since, the proper export authorization to do so. The story of how he accomplished this has passed through enough retellings to acquire the texture of legend, and like most legends, it contains a core of documented fact surrounded by an atmosphere of dramatic elaboration. What is certain is that the seeds were loaded. What is less certain, and still contested, is precisely what Wickham told Brazilian customs authorities about what he was carrying. The version that Wickham himself promoted was boldly theatrical. He claimed to have chartered the cargo steamer Amazonas, filled it with carefully packed seeds concealed beneath banana leaves, and talked his way past port officials by describing the cargo as delicate botanical specimens destined for Kew Gardens, specimens that would perish if subjected to the delay of thorough inspection. Whether this account is entirely true, partly embellished, or substantially invented for the enjoyment of dinner party audiences in London is difficult to determine with precision. What the historical record does establish is that Wickham had been in contact with the director of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, Sir Joseph Hooker, who'd commissioned the seed collection as part of a deliberate imperial project. The British government and Kew funded the venture. Wickham was not acting on personal initiative alone. He was executing a plan. Brazil has since called it the greatest act of biopiracy of the 19th century, and the charge is not frivolous. The Hevea tree was Brazilian. The knowledge of its properties, the method of bleeding it, collecting its latex, working with its peculiarities, had been developed over generations by indigenous peoples of the Amazon basin. The commercial boom built on that knowledge had made fortunes in Manaus and Iquitos, and now the biological foundation of that entire economy was sailing toward England in the hold of a chartered steamer, listed, if Wickham's account is accurate, as harmless academic material destined for curious gentlemen in English greenhouses. Kew received the seeds. What happened next was by any botanical measure a disappointment. Of the roughly 70,000 seeds that arrived, only around 2,400 germinated. Some sources suggest the figure may have been slightly higher, closer to 2,700, but the range is consistent. Somewhere near 4% of the cargo took root. The failure rate was enormous. The success rate was enough. The seedlings that did emerge were packed into Wardian cases, sealed glass and wood containers designed to keep delicate plants alive across long ocean voyages, and dispatched to British territories across the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, Singapore, British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. These were colonial territories with tropical climates, available land, access to controlled labour, and direct connections to British imperial shipping routes. In other words, they were everything the Amazon was not: manageable, accessible, systematically administered, and insulated from the jurisdictional complications that made the putumayo so difficult to govern and so easy to exploit without consequence. The man who would eventually organise the commercial development of rubber cultivation in Malaya was Henry Nicholas Ridley, the director of the Singapore Botanic Gardens, known to his contemporaries as Mad Ridley, for the obsessive enthusiasm with which he pressed rubber seeds on anyone who would plant them. His persistence was eventually vindicated on a scale that probably exceeded his own ambitions. The Malayan estates he championed began producing rubber in quantities that the Amazon, for all its centuries of ecological head start, could not match. The Amazon's production depended on scattered wild trees, on the physical endurance of tappers navigating vast and dangerous forest territories, on a labour system sustained by debt and coercion. The plantation model was different in kind. Trees were planted in orderly rows, tapped on predictable schedules, and harvested by workers on a scale that the wild forest could never approximate. By the early years of the 20th century, the arithmetic had shifted decisively. Asian plantations were outproducing the Amazon. By the time Casement was writing his reports on the putumayo in 1911, the days of Amazonian rubber dominance were already numbered. The seeds that Wickham had extracted from the forest in 1876 had, in the space of a single generation, redirected the entire geography of global rubber production. Today, Southeast Asia supplies somewhere between 80 and 90% of the world's natural rubber, with some estimates placing the figure even higher. The Amazon, where the trade began, where the violence concentrated, where tens of thousands of lives were consumed in the service of a commodity boom, became a marginal supplier in its own story. There is something worth sitting with in that trajectory. The scale of suffering documented in the putumayo, the quota systems, the floggings, the correrias, the deaths, was not simply the product of individual cruelty or particular corporate greed, though both were present in abundance. It was also, in part, the product of a system that had no alternative model. The Amazon's rubber could not be produced efficiently any other way, given the dispersal of wild trees and the remoteness of the forest. Coercion filled the gap that efficient organisation might have occupied. The plantation model that Wickham's seeds made possible was not humane. Asian rubber estates had their own histories of exploitation and forced labour, but it was a different kind of production, one that did not require the same frontier violence to sustain its quotas. The shift in geography was also, in a quiet and morally ambiguous way, a shift in the architecture of extraction. This is where the story of the stolen seeds complicates itself. Wickham's act is condemned, correctly, as biopiracy, the appropriation of a biological resource from a sovereign nation for the benefit of a colonial power, without consent, without compensation, without the legal documentation that a proper export would have required. The Brazilian Amazon paid for that theft with the eventual collapse of its rubber economy. Towns that had built opera houses and imported Italian marble to line their streets watched the commodity that funded all of it evaporate, diverted to estates that had been grown from seeds removed without permission. And yet the trade those seeds disrupted was itself built on a foundation of blood. The rubber barons who lost their monopoly were the same men, or the inheritors of the same systems, under which the indigenous peoples of the Putumayo had been enslaved, mutilated, and killed. The geopolitical turning point that Wickham's seeds represented cannot be separated from the horror they eventually displaced. The empire that commissioned the theft was, simultaneously, the empire whose imperial networks eventually carried the exposure of what the Amazon rubber system had done to its people. What remains when the competing condemnations settle is not a clear moral resolution, but a portrait of a world in which every significant act of the rubber trade, from the first tapping of a wild tree to the germination of stolen seeds in an English greenhouse, was embedded in the logic of imperial power and its attendant costs. Wickham has been called a hero by some and a criminal by others, and the historical evidence supports neither verdict entirely. He was a functionary of a system that did not need his heroism or his villainy, only his passage upriver and his willingness to load seeds onto a ship and talk his way past whoever was standing between them and the open ocean. Those seeds, sealed in their Wardian cases, crossing the Indian Ocean toward a different kind of future, were about to transform not only the rubber trade but the physical landscape of an entire region. Forests cleared, coastlines altered, shipping lanes redrawn, in ways that connected the stolen biology of the Amazon to the next chapter of the story, playing out beneath the waves of distant seas. By the time those Wardian cases had sweated their way through the tropics and were unloaded in the east, the world that waited for them was already shaped by charts, coaling stations, and the disciplined geometry of empire. The Indian Ocean was not a blank expanse like the white spaces that still haunted Amazon maps. It was a worked sea, crossed and recrossed by mail steamers, troop ships, pilgrim traffic, and the steady commercial pulse that connected London to Bombay, Calcutta to Rangoon, Singapore to Hong Kong. A seedling is a small thing to carry into such a system, but that was the point. In the Amazon, rubber had been a hunt. Long miles through thick forest for scattered trees, each one guarded by distance and by the fact that no one could make the landscape obey. In British Malaya and Ceylon, in parts of India, and across the Dutch East Indies, rubber could be made to line up. It could be taught to stand still. On the estates that grew up in the first years of the 20th century, the heavier tree stopped being a wild resource and became a unit of calculation. Land was surveyed and drained. The trees were spaced with intention. Figures differ by manual and period, but the idea was consistent. Regular intervals, predictable growth, predictable yields. Paths were cut not as trails of survival but as lanes of management. Firebreak belts were cleared to stop a stray burn from turning into an estate-wide disaster. Ditches and drains drew water away in the wet season and kept the roots from rotting. It was ecological organisation as an industrial tool, the plantation as a machine built out of soil, rain and bark. And then there was the cut itself, the controlled wound that turned a living tree into a supplier. Managers and agricultural officers obsessed over technique, because a bad cut could kill the very asset it was meant to harvest. The tapping systems were standardised, often described in the language of diagrams rather than the language of the forest. Half herringbone incisions, angled grooves to guide the latex into a cup, repeated on strict schedules so the bark could recover and the yield could be sustained. In the Amazon, a tapper might have a string of trees spread out across a vast circuit, bleeding one and then vanishing into the undergrowth to find the next. On an Asian estate, a worker could move down a row as if walking a corridor, performing the same motion hundreds of times before the day heated up. The violence did not vanish in this transformation. It changed its shape. On the wild rubber frontier, violence had often been immediate, improvised and spectacular. Quota terror enforced with whips and guns, hostage-taking, raids, mutilations, the kind of cruelty that left witnesses shaken and testimony raw. On the plantation, coercion more often lived in the paperwork and the contract, in the way a labourer arrived and the way it became difficult to leave. The workforce was assembled from the currents of empire, indentured Indian labourers, Chinese migrants, and in some places local Malay workers pulled into a wage economy that offered cash but also demanded obedience. The records do not always agree on proportions. Some estates leaned heavily one way, others another, and the numbers were not uniformly recorded, but the pattern is clear enough. Plantation rubber did not need Correrías. It needed recruitment networks, foremen, and the quiet force of dependency. A man in an office could now plan the harvest. That was the new power. The estate manager did not have to imagine what the forest might yield this month, or what a flooded tributary might prevent. He could look at planted acreage, at the age of the trees, at the schedule of tapping, and make promises to buyers, promises that could be backed by timetables and tonnage rather than bravado. The growth was startlingly fast. Contemporary statistics vary depending on which consular report or trade journal you trust, and the line between careful measurement and promotional optimism can be thin in boom times. But even with that caution, the direction is unmistakable. In the Malay states, production surged so quickly that it was reported in neat seasonal blocks. In one 3-month period of 1910, about 3,810 tonnes were produced. In the comparable period in 1913, about 5,625 tonnes, a jump of more than half in just a few years. Acreage followed the same expanding logic. By 1912, rubber estates had spread across vast tracts. Figures often cited include roughly 220,000 acres in Ceylon and around 430,000 acres in the Malay states, with more land already being cleared and planted as investors chased the next dividend. These numbers mattered not only because they were large, but because they were legible. They could be written in prospectuses. They could be cabled to London. They could be used to secure loans, to justify rail spurs, to expand docks. The Amazon's rubber was valuable, but it was always vulnerable to the forest's refusal to become a factory. Southeast Asia's rubber was becoming, unmistakably, an industry, and once it was an industry, the sea reorganized itself around it. The old rubber geography had been a river story that became an Atlantic story. Latex gathered in the interior, carried down to Belém or out through Manaus, shipped across the ocean to European ports, and then transformed into the tyres, belts and seals of the new mechanical age. That route had its romance and its dread. Endless water, storm lines off the coast, the sense of a commodity dragged from a green hell into the bright accounting of modern finance. Now the centre of gravity tilted eastward. Rubber began to pour not from the mouth of the Amazon, but from deep water harbours that face the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, Singapore, Penang, Batavia, and the great ports of India such as Kolkata. A plantation might be inland, but it was inland with roads, rail links, and administrative attention. Latex could be coagulated, packed, and moved as a standardized cargo. It could be scheduled like tea, like tin, like sugar. Another line item in the manifests of empire. One can imagine the paperwork alone. Bills of lading stamped and restamped, cargoes insured against fire and sea, destination ports named in brisk handwriting. Rubber was no longer an exotic substance that arrived in irregular lumps with the smell of smoke and forest. It arrived as a commodity that could be graded, packed, and promised. This changed ships. On the Amazon, vessels had been shaped by shallow channels and uncertain rivers, sternwheelers, small steamers, craft that could nose up to crude jetties and take on bales in the rain. In the eastern seas, rubber joined the traffic of ocean-going steamers, ships that lived by coal and time, by the rhythm of coaling stations and harbour lights. They crossed from Singapore through the Strait of Malacca, past Ceylon's southern edge, and aimed for the Suez Canal or the Cape depending on the era and the market. The canal, opened in 1869, had already begun tightening the world, pulling Asian trade into a quicker orbit around Europe. Rubber gave that orbit a new urgency. With each year that plantation output rose, the Atlantic Amazon route became less central. Insurance firms, shipping lines, and manufacturers adjusted quietly, without sentiment. Factories that once looked to para could now contract reliably through Singapore brokers. Naval yards and industrial workshops could count on more regular deliveries. The map of dependence changed. The Amazon's river ports began to feel in commercial terms like distant backwaters compared with the efficient funnels of Southeast Asian ports. The eclipse happened in stages, and the statistics capture it like a ship's log captures a change in wind. Around 1912, plantation rubber worldwide was reported at roughly 30,000 tons, while Amazon wild rubber hovered a little above 42,000, figures that shift slightly depending on the source, sometimes given as 28,000 or 33,000 for plantation production that year, but always rising. Then came the moment that mattered for the psychology of the market, the 1913-14 season, when plantation output exceeded Amazon output for the first time. It was not simply an economic milestone, it was a transfer of sovereignty over a commodity, from a forest that could not be fully controlled to territories governed by colonial administrations built for control, and the ports themselves, those hard-edged meeting places of sea and land, changed to accommodate the new flow. Warehouses expanded, dock labour became specialised, railheads crept outward toward the estates. The rubber cargo joined tin and copra and spices in the stacked logic of imperial trade, and the harbour became a kind of engine room where global industry was fed. There is a temptation, in hindsight, to treat the plantation system as a more civilised replacement for frontier brutality, as if straight rows of trees imply straightened morals, but discipline can be quiet and still be cruel. The plantation's order did not eliminate suffering. It redistributed it into different forms, long hours under overseers, fines and debts, the hard bargaining over wages, the vulnerability of migrants far from home, and the constant pressure of schedules that treated a human body as another part of the state's machinery. What it did eliminate, what it made unnecessary, was the Amazon's particular dependence on raiding and terror to bridge the gap between scattered trees and industrial demand. The estate could produce without sending men with guns into villages. That distinction matters historically, not as an excuse, but as an explanation for why the market shifted so decisively. Capital prefers predictability. Empires prefer systems they can count. And so the eastern seas filled with rubber's new itinerary. It moved outward from plantation districts to port cities whose names became shorthand for trade. Singapore's godowns, Penang's warehouses, Batavia's colonial offices where Dutch clerks tallied exports. It moved onward through choke points and straits, through the Red Sea's heat and the Mediterranean's crowded lanes, or around the Cape with its weathered reputation. It arrived in Europe not as a forest mystery but as a routine necessity. Yet even in this new, organised world, a shadow remained. The reminder that rubber for all its modern uses was still a substance wrested from living landscapes. Estates required land, and land was not empty. Forests were cleared. Ecologies were simplified into monoculture. The complex web of the tropics replaced by the repeating pattern of one valuable species. The plantations order came with its own vulnerabilities, disease, market swings, the fragility of a system that depends on uniformity. The managers knew this, which is why they worried over drainage and spacing and fire breaks, why they wrote manuals and enforced rules. They were trying to keep a living crop from slipping back into chaos. And the sea, always the sea, carried the consequences. Rubber's new centre in Southeast Asia meant that maritime power, commercial shipping, and imperial administration converged even more tightly. The same routes that carried latex and bales of processed rubber could carry troops, telegram parts, weapons, and officials. Trade and control travelled together, each justifying the other. In the Amazon, a river steamer could be a floating fortress, its deck crowded with men whose authority came from rifles and from the isolation of the forest. In the East, authority was often built into the infrastructure itself: the port police, the customs house, the maritime courts, the colonial bureaucracy that could register a company, enforce a contract, and punish a strike. The violence was not always less. It was simply embedded deeper into the system, harder to point to as a single man's cruelty, easier to mistake for the natural order of business. And this is where the story begins to slip, almost inevitably, beneath the surface. Because rubber was not only for tyres and factory belts, not only for the rising traffic of motor cars and the industrial appetites of Europe and America, it was also for navies, for undersea cables, for the seals and gaskets that kept seawater out and pressure in. The plantation boom in the eastern seas did not merely reorder trade, it fed the technologies that made oceans feel smaller and more governable. As rubber moved through Singapore and Penang and Batavia, another tropical substance, older in maritime importance, stranger in its properties, was being hunted through the forests of Southeast Asia as well. It didn't come from Hevea, but from Palaquium trees. It was not latex, but a hard, mouldable resin that could be warmed and shaped, then cooled into a tough, insulating sheath. Gutta-percha had already proven that a forest could be made to serve the sea in ways most people would never see. It had wrapped the nerves of the undersea world, the telegraph lines that stitched continents together. And as plantation rubber rose, the demand for gutta-percha and other insulating materials surged alongside the ambitions of empires that wanted their messages to travel faster than any ship. So while the plantations marched across the land in orderly rows, another extraction moved in a less orderly way through the same region's forests, driven by the needs of ships, cables, and the hidden architecture of connection. The rubber world had shifted eastward, yes, but the darkest questions of the trade were not done migrating. They were simply taking on water, heading out beyond the harbour mouth, and sinking into the depths where the sea keeps its secrets. Below the harbour mouth, below the reach of anchor chains and the shadow of ship hulls, the seafloor held its own kind of history. It was not written in stone or in the rings of trees, but in something stranger. A dark, waxy sheath stretched across thousands of miles of cold mud and crushed sediment, connecting continents with a precision that no sailing ship could match. That sheath was Gutta-percha, and its story runs parallel to the rubber trade in ways that feel, on first encounter, almost too convenient to be true. Yet there it is, another tropical tree, another forest, another extraction that the world demanded and the forest paid for. Gutta-percha came from plaquium trees, a genus native to the Malay Peninsula, Singapore, and the forests of Borneo. In appearance, the raw material looked unpromising, a milky sap that dried into a hard, brown lump, with none of the elastic springiness that made Hevea latex so immediately appealing. Where natural rubber stretched and snapped back, gutta-percha hardened on cooling and stayed hard. Where rubber softened in heat, gutta-percha could be warmed in near boiling water until it turned pliable and mouldable, shaped by hand into any form the engineer required, and then left to cool into something approaching permanence. It was thermoplastic in behaviour before that word existed as an industrial category. What made it extraordinary, what drew navies, telegraph companies, and engineers into an obsession with plaquium trees, was a single critical property. Gutta-percha did not conduct electricity. It resisted salt water, resisted acids, resisted the crushing pressure of the deep ocean with a stubbornness that no other affordable material could match. For most of human history, this combination of properties would have been a curiosity. Then the telegraph came, and suddenly the combination was the most valuable characteristic a substance could possess. The first serious undersea cable was laid across the English Channel in 1850, between Dover and Calais. It was a tentative thing, thin and vulnerable, and it did not last long before a French fisherman, mistaking it for exotic seaweed, cut it from the seafloor and brought a piece to shore to show his neighbours. But the cable's insulating layer, 2 coats of gutta-percha wrapped around the copper conductor, had proven the concept. A wire could be made to carry a signal through seawater, across a channel floor from one nation to another in seconds. The implications expanded outward from that moment like rings from a dropped stone. The dream that followed was larger, and the engineering required to realise it remains one of the most audacious projects of the 19th century. Connecting Britain to North America by telegraph meant laying a cable across the full width of the Atlantic, more than 2,000 miles of ocean, much of it at depths that no human had yet visited and that instruments could barely measure. The cable-laying expeditions of 1857 and 1858 involved ships of enormous size and ambition, including the converted warship HMS Agamemnon and the American vessel Niagara, each carrying coiled miles of cable in their holds. The technical failures were spectacular. Cables snapped under tension, splice joints failed in the dark, signals faded and then vanished. The first successful Atlantic crossing in 1858 lasted only a few weeks before the signal died completely. It took until 1866, after years of revised engineering and a second great effort aboard the massive steamship Great Eastern, to establish a reliable transatlantic connection. Throughout every version of this project, Gutta-percha was not a supporting player. It was the architecture. The Gutta-percha Company, established in London in 1845, supplied the insulating core for cable after cable, more than 14,000 miles of it for 64 separate cables by 1865. Britain's imports of gutta-percha tell their own story of dependency. By 1851, some 30,000 long hundredweight had been recorded arriving in British ports in a single year, figures that later accounts sometimes smooth into a more modest, over 1,000 tons annually by 1861. The exact numbers varying depending on the source and the season, but always large, always rising, always connected to the ambitions of men sitting in London offices who wanted their messages to travel faster than any ship. Naval engineers watching the telegraph company's work recognised something useful. A material that could resist salt water and pressure under the Atlantic floor could also resist salt water inside the hulls and piping systems of warships. Gutta-percha began appearing in Admiralty orders for speaking tube installations, those brass-mouthed voice pipes that let officers call to each other across decks and compartments, where its flexibility and imperviousness to moisture made it far more reliable than rubber compounds. It was used to line water pipes and seal hoses where metal fittings met flexible tubing. It showed up as gaskets in pumping systems, in the seals around valves, and in the early fittings associated with torpedo tube mechanisms and submarine hose connections, where the margin between a good seal and catastrophic flooding was measured in fractions of an inch. Documentation for some of these naval applications is patchy. Official records spoke of sealed hoses and gaskets, and sealing applications in naval fittings, and the scale of torpedo-related use in particular is difficult to pin down with precision. But the pattern is clear. Wherever a ship needed to keep two environments apart, wherever the boundary between inside and outside had to be maintained against pressure and salt, gutta-percha was a preferred solution. What this meant for forests thousands of miles away was something no telegraph engineer in London or naval architect in Portsmouth was required to think about. Palaquium trees do not produce their sap in abundance. A mature specimen, needing 35 years or more to reach useful size, might yield around 16 pounds of gutta-percha in its lifetime of tapping, if it survived the process. The problem was that harvesting gutta-percha was not like tapping rubber. It required felling the tree. The most efficient way to extract the sap was to cut the tree down, strip the bark and drain the latex before it hardened in the tropical air. A single tree, a single yield, and then nothing. Replanting required patience that commerce rarely allowed. The forest around Singapore and across the Malay Peninsula was stripped of mature Palaquium specimens with a speed that alarmed even some contemporaries, who noted the disappearing stands and wondered aloud whether the supply could survive the demand. By the mid-19th century, extraction had moved deeper into Borneo's interior and along less accessible stretches of the peninsula's forest, following the retreating tree line with the same restless logic that had driven rubber tappers ever deeper into the Amazon. The men doing the work were not engineers calculating cable specifications. They were collectors moving through dense forest with cutting tools, felling trees that had grown for a generation, extracting the gutta-percha from bark and trunk, and carrying it to rivers that could deliver it to Singapore's wharves, where it would be cleaned, dried, pressed into blocks, and loaded onto ships heading for London. The cable-laying vessel floating in mid-Atlantic, its crew watching coils of insulated wire disappear over the stern into black water, was at one end of a chain whose other end was a man in Borneo standing next to a felled tree. Those two men never met. The cable they shared never connected them in any way they would have recognised. But the connection was real, and the forest paid the price for it. Gutta-percha would hold its dominance in undersea cable insulation for roughly 80 years, remaining the standard material until synthetic polyethylene began replacing it in the 1930s. In those 8 decades, the trade-stripped forests opened the deep ocean to communication and made the world's navies and commercial empires dependent on a substance that almost no one outside the industry could name or locate on a map. It insulated the nerves of empire, the cables carrying grain prices, military orders, diplomatic dispatches and commercial contracts, while the forests that produced it contracted quietly around the edges. The seafloor received its sheathing. The Palaquium trees gave everything they had. And the forests of Southeast Asia, already under pressure from the rising plantation rubber economy, faced yet another appetite arriving from the sea. The numbers, when laid out plainly, carry a weight that the celebratory language of the Victorian telegraph age never quite acknowledged. By 1851, Britain was importing roughly 30,000 long hundredweight of gutta-percha in a single year. Each mature Palaquium tree standing for 35 years or more in the layered shade of a Southeast Asian dipterocarp forest offered perhaps 16 pounds of usable latex, and offered it only once because the most efficient harvest was also a final one. The tree came down, the bark was stripped, the sap was drained, and what had taken a generation to grow was gone in an afternoon. Scale that arithmetic across the ambitions of an era that wanted to wire every ocean floor and seal every naval hose, and the forest arithmetic becomes brutal. Scholars who have studied this period with care describe what happened to those dipterocarp forests as a Victorian ecological disaster, a phrase that sounds retrospective and perhaps too neat, but that reflects something genuinely documented in colonial records of the time. Even contemporaries remarked on the vanishing stands. Observers in Singapore noted that the forest nearest the trading wharves had been stripped of mature Palaquium specimens within years of the telegraph boom taking hold. The extraction frontier moved, as it always does, inward and upriver, following the last stands of trees old enough to be worth felling. Collectors moved deeper into Borneo's interior and along less visited stretches of the peninsula. The forest retreated before demand the way a tide retreats before an engineering project, steadily, without announcement, and without anyone truly responsible for stopping it. This pattern was not unique to Southeast Asia. Something structurally identical had been unfolding on the other side of the world for decades, along the brown tributaries of the Amazon basin, where the logic of extraction had always pushed outward from the known toward the unclaimed. Amazon rubber exports grew from around 2,100 tons in 1855 to 10,000 tons by 1879, and that expansion was not simply a story of more tapping and more canoes. It was a story of moving frontiers, of forest entered and altered, of indigenous communities swept into labour systems that bore no resemblance to any exchange they had chosen. The Putumayo genocide, which killed between 30 and 40,000 people by most estimates, the precise figure remaining contested, the horror not, was the most documented expression of what that expansion meant for the people who lived inside those forests. It was not an aberration. It was the logical consequence of a global system that required volume, required it on schedule, and required it at prices that only certain kinds of coercion could sustain. What connects Gutta-percha and heavier rubber across their geographic distance is not simply a structural resemblance between two extraction industries. It is something deeper in the way the modern world has consistently treated forest as a repository rather than an ecosystem, a place where value waits to be removed and shipped elsewhere. In the Amazon, that removal was liquid and elastic, harvested by men walking bleeding trails between trees. In the forests of Borneo and the Malay Peninsula, it was slower and more absolute. You waited 35 years for a tree to reach maturity, then you felled it in a morning. Both systems shared the same foundational indifference to regeneration. Neither the rubber baron of Iquitos nor the Gutta-percha trader of Singapore built their wealth by imagining the forest 50 years forward. The demand was present, the payment was present, and the tree or the tapper was present. Everything else was someone else's problem, and very often that someone else had no power to make it matter. The telegraph era added a particular irony to this pattern, because no technology of the 19th century was more enthusiastically described as a gift to humanity than the undersea cable. Journalists, politicians, and engineers competed to express how completely the cable had changed the world, how it had annihilated distance, how it carried civilization outward to its furthest reaches. Queen Victoria's first message to President Buchanan across the completed 1858 cable spoke of the occasion as a means of diffusing mutual goodwill and a harbinger of peace among nations. The Great Eastern's successful 1866 connection produced scenes of public celebration in London and New York that bordered on the ecstatic. These were, in the language of the time, the triumphs of connection, of a world knit together by intelligence, ingenuity, and the patient laying of wire. What the celebrations did not include was any mention of Borneo, or of the men cutting plaquium trees in forests that no telegraph message would ever reference, or of the fact that the material enabling this celebrated annihilation of distance was itself being annihilated in the process, that millions of trees, by any reasonable accounting, were destroyed to insulate the cables that made global communication possible. The connection came at a cost, and the cost was distributed with the same asymmetry that characterized the rubber trade, the spice trade, and every extractive relationship the maritime empires had built. Those at one end of the cable celebrated. Those at the other end of the supply chain disappeared along with the forest they had inhabited. There is a further dimension that naval history makes visible. The ships that laid the cables, the gunboats that protected colonial ports, the steamers that carried gutta-percha from Singapore to London, all of them depended on the material they were simultaneously depleting. The same substance sealing the torpedo tube fittings and the speaking tube installations of naval vessels was the substance being stripped from forests to meet their own demand. The Admiralty's orders for gutta-percha were part of the same market pressure driving extractors deeper into Borneo's interior. The Empire's navy was both the vehicle of extraction and one of its significant consumers. The forest that insulated the nerves of empire also had to survive the Empire's appetite, and in the end could not fully manage either task. By the time synthetic polyethylene began displacing gutta-percha in undersea cable applications during the 1930s, the ecological damage to Southeast Asia's diptera carp forests was already decades old and largely irreversible at the scale of individual tree populations. The plaquium groves that had existed before the telegraph boom were gone. What replaced them, in the slow way that forest eventually reasserts itself, was not the same. The biological diversity of a mature diptera carp stand is not quickly recovered. The trees that took 35 years to yield 16 pounds of latex and then surrendered their lives to the ocean floor of the Atlantic did not return within any time frame the Victorian era was required to contemplate. and the Amazon, meanwhile, continued to carry the weight of what had been done to it during the rubber years. The frontier violence of the Putumayo did not end when the boom ended. It left communities shattered, populations reduced, and forest trails that had once run between tapping trees now running between memory and silence. The land bore the marks of what connection had cost. The exported tonnage figures from the rubber cycle's peak years, rising so smoothly on a chart, rising so cleanly through the decades, tell nothing of that. Numbers rarely do, unless someone insists on reading what stands behind them. What the telegraph age actually built, then, was not simply a network of copper wire and insulating sheath across the ocean floor. It built a global infrastructure on the assumption that distant forests and distant people were available resources, that their reduction was an acceptable price for speed, for connection, for the annihilation of distance that everyone on the receiving end of a cable message found so extraordinary. The forest stripped for connection did not vanish silently or inevitably. It vanished because choices were made, demand was created, and the cost was arranged to fall somewhere else. That somewhere else was always the forest, and always the people living inside it. The cables carried the messages of empire from continent to continent. The cost of carrying them stayed behind, buried in the soil of places the messages never mentioned. Even as Southeast Asian plantations steadily eclipsed the Amazon in the global rubber ledger, something curious persisted in the imagination of industrialists, investors, and adventurers who had never set foot near the Tapajos or the Putumayo. The idea would not quite die that Amazon rubber was different, purer, somehow more authentic, closer to the original thing. Plantation latex, grown in neat rows under equatorial skies in Malaya or Sumatra, carried with it the taint of the engineered, the managed, the second-hand. The Amazon, by contrast, still glowed in certain minds as a place of inexhaustible natural abundance, a forest cathedral producing latex the way it produced rainfall, generously, untouched, beyond the corruptions of system and schedule. It was, like most myths, a story told by people who did not have to live inside it. The history behind that myth was, of course, considerably darker. Every previous section of this story has traced what the Amazon's rubber actually looked like from the inside. The bleeding trails between trees, the quota stations along the Putumayo, the steamboats ferrying extracted latex past the bodies of the system that produced it. The forest was never a pristine warehouse. It was a landscape that had been entered, altered, and bled by a labour system of extraordinary violence. When that system finally collapsed under the weight of Asian competition and its own documented atrocities, the Amazon did not return to some pre-contact innocence. It returned to silence, a silence shaped by absence, by communities destroyed, by trails grown over, and rivers still carrying the memory of what had moved along them. But myths have their own metabolism. They absorb contradictions slowly, if at all, and they survive the facts that should correct them because they are not really about facts. They are about desire, and what certain powerful men desired as the 20th century opened and automobiles multiplied across American roads at a pace that strained every rubber supply chain in existence, was a version of the Amazon that could deliver on its legendary promise, this time with the right management behind it. Henry Ford believed he was that management. In 1928, the Ford Motor Company secured a concession of approximately 10,000 square kilometers along the Tapajos River in the Brazilian state of Pará. Ford's ambition was precise and grandiose in equal measure. He wanted to break the British grip on the global rubber supply that had been tightening since Wickham's seeds germinated into plantation dominance decades before. His automobiles consumed rubber at a scale that made him perpetually vulnerable to price movements set by markets centred in London and Kuala Lumpur. The Amazon, in his mind, offered an escape from that dependency. It offered a return to the source. What Ford built on that concession was not a rubber plantation in any conventional sense. It was an attempt to transplant an American industrial town into the middle of the Brazilian rainforest and make it function as though geography was simply an inconvenience to be overruled by engineering and moral certainty. Fordlandia, and the name itself carries a kind of ideological weight, as though the forest had been annexed by a brand rather than a nation, rose from the riverbank with a water tower, a school, a hospital, neat rows of clapboard houses painted in cheerful colours, and a swimming pool. It was to have sidewalks. It was to have a central square. Workers would arrive on schedule, labour on schedule, eat in the company canteen, and return home on schedule to their American-style cottages in a landscape that happened to be surrounded by 40 million acres of tropical forest. Ford's social vision for the settlement was as rigid as its grid plan. Alcohol was banned within the compound. So was tobacco. Women not employed by the company were discouraged. Football, the sport the Brazilian workers lived and breathed, was replaced with square dancing, which Ford had recently become enthusiastic about and believed to be a morally improving pastime. The canteen served whole-grain bread and brown rice, dietary choices Ford had arrived at through his own idiosyncratic reading of nutritional science. Workers from communities along the Tapajós, men who had grown up in the forest and along its rivers, found themselves suddenly required to adapt to a New England sensibility imposed by a man in Dearborn, Michigan, who had never spent a night in Brazil and apparently saw no reason why the jungle should not be simply reorganized along the same lines as his River Rouge plant. The forest, predictably, had different ideas. The rubber trees, Hevea brasiliensis, the same species that had made Amazon fortunes and then fled to Asian plantations in Wickham's smuggled seeds, were planted with the confidence of an industrial operation rather than the patience of a botanist. They were planted densely in tight rows in a region where the leaf blight fungus Microcyclus ule had always been present and always been waiting. In South American forests, Hevea had survived the blight precisely because natural growth spread trees apart, breaking the contagion's path between hosts. Fordlandia's plantation logic did the opposite. It gathered the trees into close formation and offered the blight an ideal corridor. Leaf after leaf darkened and fell. Pest infestations followed. The canopy that should have thickened into a productive stand became instead a case study in what happens when ecological advice is ignored in favour of the certainty that one already knows what one is doing. The social order collapsed with similar speed. In 1930, Fordlandia's workers rose in what became known as the Revolt of the Broken Pans, an uprising that began in the canteen, where resentments over food, rules, working hours, and the comprehensive humiliation of having one's entire culture replaced by someone else's had been accumulating into something combustible. Managers fled into the forest. Equipment was damaged. The Brazilian military eventually restored order, but the ideal of the self-contained jungle utopia had already cracked beyond convincing repair. Ford moved operations downstream to a new site called Belterra in 1933, hoping a different location might escape the blight and the accumulated grievances. It did not. The biological problem followed, as biological problems do. By 1945, with the Second World War having accelerated the development of synthetic rubber alternatives, and with Fordlandia and Belterra having between them produced an estimated 750 tons of latex, none of which ever reached a single Ford factory, the company quietly sold the entire concession back to the Brazilian government for $250,000. The total investment had been approximately $20 million, the equivalent of something close to $200 million in contemporary terms. The jungle received its land back. The water tower still stands. What makes Fordlandia significant in the longer story of rubber is not simply its failure, though the failure was spectacular enough to be instructive on its own terms. What makes it significant is what it reveals about the persistence of a particular kind of myth. Ford arrived in the Amazon with the same foundational assumption that had animated every other powerful interest to enter that landscape before him, that the forest was a resource awaiting the correct application of external will. The rubber barons of the Putumayo era had believed something similar. They believed that indigenous labour could be organised by violence into a productive system, that the forest would yield on schedule if the right pressures were applied to the right people. Ford believed something structurally analogous, that the forest would yield on schedule if the right engineering and the right moral framework were applied to the landscape and the workers within it. Both beliefs shared the same foundational error, which was the conviction that the Amazon was a problem to be solved by someone arriving from outside it. The romantic image of Amazon rubber as pure, original, superior to the plantation product, that image survived every correction the actual history offered because it was never really about rubber. It was about the desire to possess something that seemed to have escaped the contaminations of the modern world, to find a source of wealth that had not yet been entangled in the compromises and dependencies that characterized every other system. Ford wanted rubber without the British monopoly. The Victorian imagination wanted a forest without history. Both wanted the Amazon to be something it had never been, innocent of what had already happened there. The rubber trees of Fordlandia are still growing in some form along the Tapajos, the plantation grid slowly softening back into something the forest can recognize. The water tower catches the light above the river at a certain angle in the late afternoon, a rusting monument to the gap between the myth of pure sources and the considerably more complicated ground beneath them. When Fordlandia's accounts were finally closed and the concession returned to Brazilian hands, the Amazon had already been living with the aftermath of its great boom for more than 3 decades. The collapse had not arrived with a single dramatic event, but had moved through the river economy the way a tide withdraws, gradually revealing what had been hidden beneath the surface of all that motion and money. By the time Ford's engineers were dismantling their surveying equipment along the Tapajos, the cities that rubber had built were already far along in the process of becoming something else, something quieter and stranger, haunted by the architectural evidence of a world that had burned very brightly and then simply stopped. Iquitos felt this most acutely. In the years around 1910, the rubber price that had sustained its peculiar grandeur began its terminal fall. By 1919, latex that had commanded more than $2.25 per kilogram at the height of the boom had dropped below 90 cents. The mathematics were unforgiving. Merchants who had imported Italian marble and Portuguese tile work for their riverfront houses found themselves unable to maintain those houses, let alone their trading operations. Barge owners whose fleets had run day and night between jungle stations and the export wharves began selling off vessels or simply leaving them to rust at their moorings. Foreign investors whose capital had flowed into the Amazonian interior via London and New York and Lisbon redirected their attention toward the Asian plantations that had caused the problem in the first place. Because capital follows yield with no particular loyalty to geography or sentiment, the people who had come to Iquitos for the boom, the tappers, the traders, the fixers, the crews of the river steamers, found the calculation of staying increasingly difficult to justify. Population that had swelled during the boom years contracted as workers and merchants scattered back toward whatever other places and possibilities they could reach. The river steam network that had threaded the basin together, carrying latex downstream and carrying European goods and company commands upstream, contracted with the same logic. Trading systems that had depended on the rubber economy simply dropped out of the chain. What remained was quieter, smaller, and faced with the problem of reinvention. The landscape those departing people left behind was an unusual kind of ruin, not the burned and crumbled ruins of military defeat, but the intact ruins of prosperity. Buildings too solid to fall quickly, too expensive to have been anything ordinary, standing now in a city that no longer quite knew what to do with them. The Casa de Fierro, the iron house sometimes linked in local legend to Eiffels workshop, remained on the Plaza de Armas. The ornate facades faced the river with the same confidence they had been constructed to project, even as the economic rationale for that confidence had evaporated. An opera house, that most unmistakable symbol of rubber-era pretension, held its place in the urban fabric. These were not relics in the sense of being fragile or forgotten. They were simply mismatched to the present that had arrived around them, monuments to a calculation that the forest and the global market had together refuted. What the city did, as cities tend to do when one resource fails them, was diversify. Timber extraction filled some of the space that rubber had vacated. Petroleum followed, as geological surveys of the broader Amazon basin revealed what lay beneath the same land that had been bled for latex. Fisheries expanded, commerce reorganized around whatever the river could still offer, and eventually, much later, tourism arrived to make the boom-era architecture itself into a kind of product. The ruins of excess transformed into an attraction for visitors who came to stand in front of iron facades and ask what had happened here. Iquitos became a gateway, a phrase that manages to be both accurate and slightly melancholy, suggesting that the city's primary value is now as a threshold to somewhere else, rather than a destination in its own right. In the broader basin, the transition away from rubber was less a collapse than a reorganization. Former rubber estates shifted toward what economic historians have described as share-tapping and sharecropping arrangements, or turned to subsistence and commercial agriculture on whatever land the jungle allowed. Communities that had been brutalized by the quota system did not recover in any simple or complete sense. The violence of the putumayo years had destroyed too much for that, had erased too many people, scattered too many survivors, broken too many of the social structures that might have supported something like recovery. But the river communities that remained found ways to continue, adapting to the economic realities that the boom's end had created, working within systems that bore the marks of what had preceded them without being entirely defined by those marks. What did not disappear, however, was the architecture of connection that the boom had built and the Asian rubber trade had subsequently inherited. The maritime routes between the Amazon basin and Atlantic export markets, between Southeast Asian plantations and the factories of Europe and North America, between the telegraph cables running beneath the ocean and the economies they served, these persisted and deepened. The infrastructure of global rubber trade, the shipping lines, the commodity exchanges, the capital networks, had been created during the Amazon boom and simply redirected once Asian production dominated. The violence and exploitation that had generated the original infrastructure left behind something that continued to function and expand long after the human cost that built it had been partially reckoned with and largely forgotten. The memories carried by the people who lived through the boom and its aftermath proved more durable than the economic systems, though they operated differently, not in ledgers or shipping manifest, but in stories, in family histories, in the particular way that people from the Putumayo or the lower Amazon described the rubber years when they described them at all. For decades, the full scale of what had happened in those river stations was known mainly to the communities who had survived it, and to the reports that Roger Casement and Walter Hardenberg had assembled from testimony that the world had briefly attended to and then allowed to drift toward the margins of official attention. It took the work of later historians, journalists and writers returning to those testimonies and to the landscapes that had held them to bring the rubber era back into a form that wider audiences could encounter and reckon with. John Tully's work on rubber as a social history and the broader scholarly attention to the Putumayo genocide reframed the boom not as a colourful chapter of Amazon adventurism, but as a documented atrocity embedded in the same global systems that produced modern consumer economies. The records that Casement had gathered, the testimonies of Barbadian workers and indigenous survivors, the company ledgers and the government correspondence, these proved to be more permanent than the rubber empires themselves, outlasting the boom towns and the steamboats and the quota stations to become the primary evidence through which the era would eventually be understood. That process of rediscovery is not finished. The physical traces of the boom, the mansions of Iquitos, the remains of river stations in the forest, the overgrown clearings where Fordlandia's grid once imposed itself on the Tapajos, continue to be studied and interpreted by people trying to understand what they mean for the present, not only as history, but as a set of patterns that did not end when the rubber price fell. The global systems the boom created did not retire gracefully. They evolved, carrying the logic of extraction and connection into new commodities and new landscapes, always moving forward while the places they had used absorbed the cost of having been used in that particular way at that particular time. The river moves past the iron facade in Iquitos the same way it always has, indifferent to the stories attached to the building it reflects. But the river also carried all of it, the latex and the ledgers, the steamboats, and the silence that followed them. What it carries now toward the next section of this story is the question of whether the systems that emerged from the rubber era have genuinely changed, or simply found new forests in which to repeat themselves. The question the river carries is not entirely hypothetical. Follow the global rubber trade far enough into the present and the patterns that define the Amazon boom, the clearing of forests, the pressure on labour, the invisibility of the people at the bottom of the supply chain, reappear in landscapes that Julio Cesar Arana never visited, in regions where the word putumayo carries no immediate meaning, but where the underlying logic of extraction has found new soil. More than half of the world's natural rubber now comes from Southeast Asia. By some measures, the proportion is considerably higher. The International Rubber Study Group's 2021 figures place Asian production at roughly 88% of the global total, with Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Laos together accounting for a share of the market that the Amazon, in its most productive years, could never have approached. The heavier trees that Henry Wickham carried out of the Amazon basin in 1876, seeds that made that long Atlantic crossing before germinating in Kew's glasshouses, took root in that region and never relinquished their grip on it. The colonial botanical project that began with 70,000 seeds and a story about casual collection became one of the defining agricultural transformations of the modern world, remaking the forest cover of a continent in the process. That remaking has accelerated. Satellite analysis published in recent years suggests that rubber-driven forest loss in Southeast Asia since 1993 exceeds 4 million hectares, a figure roughly 2 to 3 times higher than earlier estimates drawn from government statistics alone. The discrepancy matters because it reveals how difficult the scale of the transformation has been to see clearly from the ground or from the offices where policy gets made. 2/3 of that loss is concentrated in Indonesia, Thailand and Malaysia, the same countries whose plantation systems were built on the seeds and methods that colonial administrators transplanted from the Amazon. The forest that the heavier monoculture replaced was not empty land. It was primary rainforest, habitat of extraordinary biological complexity, carrying the same kind of ecological weight that the Amazon basin has always represented in arguments about what the planet can afford to lose. There is a particular irony embedded in this geography. The rubber tree is an Amazonian plant, native to a biome that the rubber trade devastated in 1 century, and is now, by different mechanisms, pressuring again. South American leaf blight, the fungal disease caused by Microcercospora oule, remains one of the most significant threats to heavier cultivation anywhere in the world. For reasons that still define the agricultural geography of rubber, the blight is essentially confined to South and Central America, which is one reason Asian plantations have been able to operate at scale without the losses that would accompany a major outbreak. But the disease has not been neutralized. Researchers studying it in 2024 recorded leaf area losses of up to 30% in infected plots, and the concern about climate-driven spread into Asian growing regions is a persistent thread running through the scientific literature. Breeding programs in Colombia and Brazil are working to develop resistant clones, but the pathogen evolves, and the confidence that geography alone will continue to contain it is not uniform among the people monitoring it most closely. What this means in practical terms is that the global rubber supply, built on a colonial transplantation, concentrated in a region far from the crop's evolutionary origin, dependent on the continued absence of a disease that could arrive with the right shift in conditions, is less stable than its current dominance might suggest. The same ecosystems that Southeast Asian rubber cultivation has displaced were also part of the biological buffer that made large-scale monoculture possible. Every hectare of primary forest converted to plantation reduces the complexity that might otherwise absorb and contain a pathogen spread. The logic runs in both directions. The clearing enables the scale, and the scale depends on conditions that the clearing itself undermines. The labour dimension of this picture is harder to quantify, but no less persistent. Approximately 85% of the world's natural rubber originates from smallholder farms, individual families and small cooperatives whose plots are difficult to audit, difficult to monitor by satellite, and frequently absent from the kind of documented supply chains that large buyers and regulators prefer to see. The smallholder who taps trees in a village in Laos or on the edge of a protected area in Indonesia is not a plantation slave in the tradition of the putumayo stations. the comparison would be historically reckless. But the invisibility of that smallholder's labour within the systems that eventually deliver a finished product to a consumer in Rotterdam or Los Angeles carries its own version of the older erasure, the tendency of global commodity networks to make legible only the parts of the chain that capital directly controls. This is where the present moment has begun to shift, at least in formal terms. The European Union's 2023 deforestation-free regulation includes rubber among the commodities it covers, requiring that products entering the European market not be linked to land cleared after December 2020. The regulation has prompted a surge of activity around certification. The Fair Rubber Association introduced a specific deforestation criterion as part of its revised standards, requiring traceability back through supply chains that, given the smallholder-dominated structure of production, are genuinely difficult to map. The Forest Stewardship Council and related programs have developed rubber-specific certification requirements. The language of transparency, traceability, and sustainability now circulates through an industry that for most of its modern history operated without any of those constraints. Whether regulation catches up to the complexity it is trying to govern remains an open question. The same methodological challenge that produced wildly different estimates of forest loss, government statistics versus satellite analysis, applies to supply chain verification. A smallholder farm that changes hands, expands onto adjacent forest, or simply lacks the documentation infrastructure to satisfy a certification auditor does not become visible just because a regulation requires it to be. The gap between the rule and its enforcement tends to be widest, precisely where production is most dispersed and least formally organised, which is to say exactly where most of the rubber comes from. What the present debates around rubber certification and deforestation share with the older history is not a simple equivalence of harm. The specific brutality of Arana's quota system has no direct counterpart in contemporary Southeast Asian agriculture. What they share is something more structural: the enduring tendency of global commodity systems to externalize their costs onto the forests and labor forces that are furthest from the consumers those systems serve. The Amazon in 1895 and the upland forests of Indonesia in 2015 are separated by a century of formal abolition, international labour standards, environmental regulation, and genuine moral progress. They're connected by the fact that the economic logic driving both situations originated in the same demand, for a material whose usefulness to industrial civilization has only increased with time, and whose full cost has never been clearly accounted for in the price that consumers pay. The steamboats that moved latex from the Putumayo stations to Iquitos, and from Iquitos to the Atlantic, are long gone. The export infrastructure they fed has been replaced by container shipping and commodity exchanges that process transactions at speeds the Peruvian Amazon company's clerks could not have imagined. But the basic architecture, forests extracted for a global market, labour made invisible by distance and complexity, the cost of what is cleared and what is spent carried by people who will not appear in the annual reports, persists in forms that the present moment is only beginning to make visible and only beginning, tentatively, to name. The rivers of the Amazon still carry silt from the places where the rubber station stood. The forests of Southeast Asia carry the genetic descendants of seeds that crossed an ocean in a ship's hold nearly 150 years ago. Between those two facts lies a great deal of history, and also a great deal of present, ongoing, unresolved, and connected to the question the previous section left open: whether the systems that emerge from the rubber era have genuinely changed, or simply learned to move more quietly through the same equation of forests, labour, and the needs of the world beyond them. There is a particular stillness that comes when you hold a piece of ordinary rubber and try to trace it backward, not to a factory, or a cargo manifest, or even a plantation row, but further, to a river, to the moment before the material became a commodity, when it was still sap moving through the cambium of a tree, still part of a forest that had its own logic, its own sounds, its own inhabitants who had named every bend of the waterway running past it. The rivers carried everything. They carried latex bales lashed to the decks of steamboats, moving down the Putumayo and the Ucayali and the Marañón toward Iquitos, where the jungle gave way to wharves and the wharves connected to the Atlantic. They carried gutta-percha harvested from the forests of Borneo and Sumatra, loaded into the holds of trading vessels bound for London, where by 1861 imports of that strange waxy polymer had surpassed 1,000 tons a year, most of it destined to be drawn into wire and coiled around copper and then lowered into the sea. By the end of the 19th century, more than 14,000 miles of cable core, nearly all of it insulated with gutta-percha, had been laid across the ocean floor, connecting continents in a network of instant communication that the people who tapped those placium trees would never see and could not have imagined. The rivers also carried silence. They carried it in both directions, outward with the cargo and inward with the boats returning for more. The violence that produced the rubber, the quota systems and the raids and the decades of terror along the Putumayo that erased between 30 and 40,000 lives from the maps and the memory of the world outside did not travel with the latex. It stayed at the source. What arrived in Manaus and Belém and Liverpool and New York was a clean material with useful properties and a price set by men who had never stood at the edge of a station in the forest. What arrived in the factories was rubber. What remained behind was everything the factories did not need to know. This is the central fact that the entire story keeps returning to. The thing that Roger Casement understood when he moved up the Putumayo in 1910 and began writing down what he saw. The commodity and its cost had been successfully separated by geography. The river itself was the instrument of that separation. It was efficient enough, long enough, and sufficiently unfamiliar to the people buying and selling at its far end that the distance functioned as a kind of amnesia, institutional and self-sustaining. The same logic ran through the gutta-percha trade, through the stripped hillsides of Borneo where the placium trees were felled rather than tapped because felling was faster, through the exhaustion of entire island forests in the pursuit of a material whose insulating properties had made the modern communications network possible. The undersea cables that hummed with the telegraph traffic of empire rested on a foundation of unsustainable extraction, of forests made silent so that the cables could carry voices. There is something worth sitting with in that inversion. The technology that made the world louder was built from the ruins of places that were never heard. Henry Wickham's 70,000 seeds carried out of Brazil in 1876 and across the Atlantic to Kew were themselves a kind of river, a current of botanical material that redirected the entire geography of global rubber production, shifting it from the Amazon to the plantation systems of Malaya and Ceylon and the Dutch East Indies, carrying the Hevea tree into soils it had never known and producing, within a generation, plantations that would supply over 90% of the world's rubber by the early 20th century. The Amazon's boom towns emptied. The steamboats found less cargo. The terror of the Putumayo stations became gradually a historical event rather than an ongoing emergency, which did not mean it became less real, only that it became easier to leave behind. What the rivers carried, ultimately, was the shape of the modern world, its communications infrastructure, its industrial materials, its connected markets and invisible supply chains. It is carried still, in the rubber that seals the cables beneath the ocean, in the tires that move goods across continents, in the ordinary objects whose origins most people will never trace and never think to question. Every material has a source, every source has a story, and the story almost always begins the same way, at a river's edge, in a forest, with people whose labour made something possible that they would not benefit from, whose lives were spent in the service of a demand they had no part in creating. The Amazon still moves toward the sea, the cables still rest in the dark below the waves. And somewhere between those two facts, if you follow the current long enough and stay quiet long enough to hear what it carries, the history does not end. It simply becomes the present, moving in the same direction it always has.